Welcome to this exploration of one of the most disturbing and inexplicable documented cases from the American South. Before we proceed, I encourage you to share in the comments where you are listening from and the precise time at which you hear this narration. We are curious to learn how far these accounts have traveled and what hours of the day or night they reach their audience. In the summer of 1844, something commenced in Vicksburg, Mississippi, that would upend everything the affluent landowners of the region believed regarding the world, regarding human nature, and regarding the boundaries dividing the natural from the supernatural. It began as murmurs among field laborers and domestic staff, spread to the offices of physicians and ministers, and eventually ascended to the highest tiers of Mississippi society, where it would stay a closely kept secret for over a century. The narrative centers on two young women who would come to be called Dalia and Lily, twin sisters whose very being appeared to flout the natural order. Born of the same womb, yet manifesting as opposites, as if night and day had taken human form. Dalia possessed skin described in auction ledgers as dark as Mississippi earth following rain, with eyes that seemed to contain depths no human gaze should contain. Lily, her twin, was afflicted, or perhaps favored, with a condition the medical men of that era termed leucism. Her skin pale as moonlight, her hair white as cotton blooms, her eyes a peculiar pale amber that appeared to alter hue depending on the light. Together, they formed a duality that observers found deeply unsettling. Not merely because of their contrasting appearances, though that was striking enough, but because of something in their presence, in the synchronized manner of their movements, in the identical intensity of their stares, which suggested they were not truly two separate individuals, but rather two expressions of a single incomprehensible entity. This is not a narrative of romance or longing in any ordinary sense. This is an account of fear, fixation, and unexplainable occurrences that surrounded two women whose very existence seemed to mock the rigid racial classifications upon which Southern society was constructed. What you are about to hear has been assembled from plantation records, medical journals, church documents, and personal diaries that stayed concealed in private collections until recent times. The first documented reference to the twins appears in the ledger of the Riverside Auction House in Natchez, Mississippi, dated June 14, 1844. The entry is unusual in several ways. Unlike typical slave auction records, which offered detailed physical descriptions to establish worth, this entry contains only a brief notation: twin females approximately 20 years of age, one of pure complexion, one afflicted with white condition, origin unknown, sold as single lot to intermediary for Belmont interests. Price withheld from public record. The purchase price, when it was eventually discovered in private Belmont family papers in 1967, was astonishing to 18 Salhausen, at a time when a strong field hand might sell for $1,500, and even the most accomplished house servant rarely exceeded $3. What rendered these particular women worth such an extraordinary amount? Reverend Samuel Hutchkins, a Methodist minister who happened to be in Natchez that June day, recorded his impressions in a journal that would not be made public until his great-granddaughter donated it to the Mississippi Historical Society in 1952. He wrote, "I have witnessed many unfortunate souls sold into bondage, a practice I find increasingly difficult to reconcile with Christian teaching. But today, I saw something that disturbed me in an entirely different way. The twin women on the block stood side by side holding hands, creating a visual contrast so stark it seemed almost supernatural. One dark as night, one pale as death itself. Yet their faces were identical in every feature. They did not weep or plead as so many do. They simply stood with a composure that seemed almost otherworldly and observed the crowd with eyes that appeared to see far more than they should. What troubled me most was that they moved in perfect synchronization, as though connected by invisible threads. When one breathed, the other breathed. When one turned her head, the other mirrored the movement exactly. The Belmont family was among the most powerful in Mississippi. They controlled 3 massive plantations, totaling more than 15,000 acres, held significant political influence in both state and national Democratic Party circles, and maintained business connections throughout the South and into New York, banking houses. Whatever motivated them to pay such an unprecedented sum for the twins, it was not a casual whim. Unlike every other enslaved person purchased by the Belmont interests that year, Dalia and Lily were not sent to labor in the cotton fields or even the main household staff. Instead, according to architectural records and servant testimonies collected decades later, they were housed in a specially prepared section of the Belmont mansion itself, in what had previously been a storage wing on the 3rd floor, accessible only through a single locked corridor. This arrangement generated immediate speculation. Plantation owners simply did not house enslaved individuals within the family living quarters except for the most trusted house servants, and even then only in designated servant areas. To dedicate an entire wing to 2 newly acquired people suggested either extraordinary favor or extraordinary caution. The truth, as later evidence would suggest, was the latter. The Belmont family was not indulging the twins. They were containing them. The first indication that something was profoundly wrong came in August 1844, barely 2 months after the twins' arrival. Dr. William Ashford, the family physician who maintained detailed records of all medical matters concerning the Belmont household, was summoned to examine injuries both sisters had sustained. His report, preserved in the archives of the Vicksburg Medical Society, contains observations that he clearly struggled to explain. I was called to attend to lacerations on the left forearms of both females known as Dalia and Lily. The wounds appeared identical in location, depth, and length, which was peculiar given that they had supposedly been injured in separate incidents. More remarkable still, based on the initial report from Mrs. Belmont's housekeeper, the wounds were approximately 48 hours old. However, upon examination, I found the injuries had healed to a degree that would typically require at least 7 to 10 days. The scar tissue was mature, the inflammation entirely absent, and both subjects reported no pain or limited mobility. Dr. Ashford's report continued with increasingly disturbed observations. What troubles me most is not merely the accelerated healing, but the absolute symmetry between the 2 subjects. When I examined Dalia's pulse, it measured approximately 48 beats per minute. Lily's pulse, measured simultaneously by my assistant, was exactly the same. And more remarkably, the beats occurred in perfect synchronization, as though both hearts were controlled by a single mechanism. When I tested their reflexes, responses occurred at precisely the same instant in both subjects. I attempted to engage them in separate examinations, placing them in different rooms, but both became severely agitated, exhibiting rapid breathing and signs of distress until they were reunited. The doctor's final observation revealed his deep unease. I must note, though it seems improper to record such a subjective impression in a medical document, that I found the subject's presence profoundly unsettling. The effect of their dual gaze, one from eyes dark as night, one from eyes pale as milk, was deeply disturbing. I left the Belmont residence with an inexplicable sense of unease that persisted for several days. The enslaved community in Vicksburg developed its own understanding of the twins, passed through whispered conversations in quarters, and during the brief periods of communal gathering permitted on Sundays, an elderly woman named Claudia interviewed in 1932 when she was 97 years old, recalled her time as a house servant on a plantation neighboring the Belmont estate. She said, "We knew not to speak their names where white folks could hear, but among ourselves we called them the night and day flowers because one bloomed in darkness and one in light, but they was the same flower split in two." The old women said they wasn't altogether of this world. Said something had touched their mama before they was born, something that marked them for a purpose we couldn't understand. The dogs knew it. Dogs always know. They would whimper and hide when the twins came near. Even the meanest fighting dogs would tuck tail and look away. But here's the strange part. The dogs couldn't decide which one scared them more. They'd look at the dark one and whine, then look at the pale one and shake. Another account recorded in 1928 from a man named Isaiah, who had been enslaved on the Belmont property, provided additional details. Miss Dalia and Miss Lily, they never worked a day that I saw. They kept them up in that east wing, and sometimes you'd see them at the window, always standing together, always touching, like they couldn't bear to be separated even by an inch. But it was the smell that told you when they'd been somewhere. Two smells, actually, coming together. One sweet like night blooming flowers, dark and heavy. The other light and clean like magnolia in the morning. But when those two smells mixed together, it made something else entirely. Something that turned your stomach while it drew you in. The phenomenon of the dual scent appears in numerous accounts from various sources. In September 1844, Judge Marcus Bellamy, a circuit court judge and close associate of the Belmont family, recorded in his private diary, attended dinner at the Belmont residence. Throughout the evening, I was aware of unusual fragrances seemingly coming from different parts of the house simultaneously. One was sweet and floral, dark and intoxicating, while the other was lighter, almost ethereal. As the night progressed, these scents seemed to merge and intensify. When I mentioned it to Charles Belmont, he became noticeably uncomfortable and changed the subject. By the autumn of 1844, the situation at the Belmont mansion had apparently become serious enough to warrant outside intervention. This is when the family made the fateful decision to involve the church, specifically requesting the assessment of Reverend Thaddeus Price, a Baptist minister known for his stern moral views and his reputation for spiritual discernment. Reverend Price's encounter with the twins is documented in fragments of his own diary that survived despite his later attempts to destroy his papers. The entry is dated November 3, 1844. I was summoned to the Belmont estate to provide spiritual counsel regarding a matter they described as delicate. Upon arrival, I was taken to the third floor, east wing, to a suite of rooms where I was introduced to the twin women known as Dalia and Lily. They sat together on a settee holding hands, their fingers intertwined in a manner that seemed almost ritualistic. The contrast between them was stark. One possessed of the darkest complexion I have ever observed, rich and seemingly luminous, the other so pale, she appeared almost translucent, like a ghost or spirit made flesh. Yet their faces were identical in every feature, mirror images that somehow emphasized rather than diminished their opposition. The diary continues. What disturbed me most was the sensation I experienced when both turned their gazes upon me simultaneously. One pair of eyes dark and fathomless, one pair pale and penetrating, but both looking at me with the exact same expression, the exact same intensity. I had the most peculiar sensation, as though their dual gaze was reaching into my mind from two directions at once, extracting memories that I had long buried. I thought of my brother dead these 20 years, and of the circumstances of his passing. I thought of words I had spoken in anger to my wife, words I had never confessed to anyone. All of this rushed through my consciousness in the space of seconds, and I had the terrible suspicion that they were aware of every thought, that together they were reading my soul like a book open before them. The entry grows more disturbed. I attempted to engage them in conversation about spiritual matters. When Dalia finally spoke, her words were not those of an ignorant or uneducated person. She said in a voice that seemed to resonate with deep tones, "Reverend, you speak of sin and salvation." Then Lily continued, her voice higher and clearer, but perfectly synchronized with her sister's rhythm. "But what if there are souls that exist outside that framework?" Then together in perfect unison, they said, "What if there are people who were never meant to be saved or damned, who simply are?" The effect of their combined voices speaking as one was profoundly unsettling. What happened next is described in a subsequent entry dated November 5th, 1844, written in noticeably shaken handwriting. "I preached this Sunday on the theme of resisting temptation, as I have done countless times before. But when I reached the pulpit and looked out at the congregation, I found I could not continue with my prepared sermon. Instead, I heard myself saying words I had not planned. I said, 'Do not fight against the temptation, for it is already among us, walking in two forms, speaking with two mouths, seeing with four eyes.' The congregation sat in stunned silence. I cannot explain what came over me. I felt as though I was standing outside my own body, watching myself speak words that were not mine." Reverend Price resigned from his pulpit in December 1844, citing health concerns. He never ministered again. His wife, in a letter to her sister, wrote, "Thaddeus is not the man he was. Something happened during his visit to that cursed house. He wakes at night in terror, and sometimes I hear him weeping and speaking of mirrors and shadows and twins who are really one. He says we are not safe, that there are things walking in the world that should not be. I fear greatly for his sanity." The impact of the twins' presence was not limited to those who met them directly. Throughout the winter of 1844 and spring of 1845, a series of inexplicable events plagued the families and businesses associated with the Belmont interests. Charles Belmont's business partner, Richard Thornton, died suddenly of an apparent stroke at age 42. His widow mentioned in her private correspondence that in the weeks before his death, Richard had become obsessed with the mirror problem at the Belmonts and had begun covering all the mirrors in their home. The overseer at one of the Belmont plantations, Thomas McKinley, began exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior in March 1845. According to testimony from other plantation employees, McKinley claimed he could hear two voices speaking in harmony at night, singing words in a language he did not recognize. He told his wife that he had seen the twins standing at the edge of the cotton fields at dusk, though the Belmont family insisted they never left their third-floor rooms. On May 3, 1845, Thomas McKinley was found dead in his quarters from what was ruled a heart attack. His final journal entry contained only a single sentence written and rewritten dozens of times. "They are not two. They are not two. They are not two." Most disturbing was the case of James Belmont, Charles's younger brother, who managed the family's cotton gin operations. In April 1845, James became convinced that the twins were somehow responsible for a series of mechanical failures. He told his wife that he had seen them standing in the doorway of the facility one evening, and as he watched, they had stepped toward each other, and their silhouettes had overlapped, creating a shadow that was neither wholly dark nor wholly light. 2 weeks later, James Belmont was discovered in his office with his service pistol beside him, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He left no formal note, but on his desk was found a piece of paper with a crude drawing showing two female figures, one shaded dark, one left white, with an equal sign followed by a single figure that was half dark and half light. Below the drawing were the words, "God help us when they remember they are one." It was after James's death that the Belmont family made the decision to invite scientific examination of the twins. Dr. Adrian Raleigh was a physician from New Orleans with advanced medical training in European institutions. He was brought to Vicksburg in June 1845 under conditions of strict confidentiality, paid a substantial fee, and given unusual latitude to conduct examinations that would not have been permitted under normal circumstances. Dr. Raleigh's research journal, discovered in 1973 in a private collection in Louisiana, provides clinical details that read like something from a Gothic novel. His entry from June 28, 1845 describes an experiment with blood transfusion. "I have conducted a series of tests to determine whether there exists any physiological connection between the subjects beyond their obvious genetic relationship. When I drew blood from Dalia and introduced it into Lily's system, not only was there no adverse reaction, but Lily's vital signs began to synchronize even more perfectly with Dalia's than before. More remarkable still, when I reversed the procedure, the same synchronization occurred. It was as though each transfusion strengthened the connection between them." A subsequent entry reveals even more disturbing findings. When the subjects are separated by distance, even by a simple partition placed between them so they cannot see or hear each other, both exhibit immediate and severe distress. Heart rates elevate dramatically, breathing becomes labored, and they begin to call out to each other in voices that seem to harmonize impossibly. But here is what truly defies explanation. Despite their obvious distress, their physiological responses remained in perfect synchronization. Their hearts beat in unison. Their breathing fell into identical patterns, as though they remained connected by some mechanism science has yet to discover. Dr. Raleigh's entries became increasingly troubled. On July 15, 1845, he wrote, "I have begun to question the wisdom of this investigation. More troubling are the dreams. For the past week, I have experienced vivid nightmares in which I see through 4 eyes simultaneously, 2 perspectives that somehow merge into a single vision that is more complete than ordinary sight. In these dreams, I am both Dalia and Lily, experiencing the world from both viewpoints at once, and I understand with terrible clarity that they are not truly separate individuals, but rather 2 halves of a single consciousness that has been split between 2 bodies." An entry from August 1, 1845 reveals Raleigh's growing fear. "I have conducted an experiment that I now deeply regret. I asked the subjects to attempt speaking simultaneously, saying different words. Dalia said, 'We are,' while Lily said, 'one soul.' But their words overlapped in such a way that the sounds merged. And what I heard was a third phrase that neither had spoken individually. Something that sounded like, 'We are one soul divided.' When I insisted they had said different things simultaneously, they smiled and Dalia said, 'Perhaps you heard the truth that lies between our words.' Lily completed the thought, 'Perhaps you heard what we actually are rather than what we appear to be.'" The final entries in Raleigh's journal reveal a man on the edge of psychological collapse. On August 18, 1845, he wrote, "This morning, while conducting routine examinations, I positioned myself so that Dalia was to my left and Lily to my right, and for a brief moment, I could see both simultaneously in my peripheral vision. In that moment, I perceived an overlay, a visual phenomenon, where the 2 figures seemed to occupy the same space, one dark and one light, creating a composite image that was neither one nor the other, but something in between. When I shifted my gaze to look directly, the effect vanished. But I cannot shake the conviction that what I glimpsed in that peripheral moment was the truth." His final entry, dated August 20, 1845, contains a desperate warning. I am leaving Vicksburg immediately and will not return. The subjects are not what the Belmonts believe them to be. They are not merely twins with an unusually strong connection. They are fragments of something that was never meant to be divided, something that is actively seeking to become whole again. I strongly advise that they be kept separated at all times, that they never be allowed to touch for extended periods, and that under no circumstances should they be allowed to see their own reflections together in a single mirror. I have seen what happens when they stand before a mirror together. The reflection does not show two figures. It shows one. Dr. Adrian Rowley was found dead in a swamp outside Vicksburg 6 days later. His body showed no signs of violence or struggle. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, though the medical examiner noted several peculiarities. The body had decomposed far more rapidly than would be expected. More bizarrely, the examiner noted that Rowley's tongue had been removed. Most disturbing was a detail mentioned only in the examiner's private notes. Rowley's eyes had changed color. One had become very dark, almost black, while the other had become pale, almost colorless. After Dr. Rowley's death, the Belmont family's approach to the twins changed dramatically. New rules were implemented with strict enforcement. The twins were no longer allowed to hold hands or touch each other for more than brief moments. Their rooms were separated with a locked door between them. All mirrors were removed from their quarters. Most significantly, they were never allowed to be in direct sunlight together at the same time. A letter from Margaret Belmont to her sister written in September 1845 provides some insight. We have been advised that the subjects must be kept as separate as possible without causing them actual harm. It seems their connection strengthens when they are in physical contact, and that sunlight somehow facilitates the strengthening. James understood this before his death, though it drove him to despair. He saw something that convinced him of the danger. I think of them sometimes, those poor creatures split between two forms longing to become whole. Is it mercy to keep them separated, or is it cruelty? Despite these precautions, incidents continued. Servants reported hearing singing at night, two voices in perfect harmony, though the twins' rooms were on opposite ends of the wing. The mixed fragrance grew stronger, permeating the entire mansion. Guests began declining invitations, though the truth was that the house had acquired a disturbing reputation. In February 1846, a new phenomenon began. Several neighboring plantation owners reported seeing identical figures, one dark and one light, standing at the edges of their properties at twilight. The figures never moved, never spoke, simply stood watching. The disturbing aspect was that these sightings occurred simultaneously at different locations miles apart. At times when the Belmont household staff swore both twins were secured in their rooms. A planter named Harrison Wade recorded in his diary, "I saw them again tonight, standing at the boundary of my northern field. I took my rifle and approached, but as I drew near, I realized I could see through them, as though they were projections or spirits. I called out and both turned to face me. Then they began to walk toward each other, and as they did, they became more solid. When they met and touched hands, there was a moment when I could not distinguish between them. Then they were gone, leaving only that strange mixed fragrance and a feeling of profound wrongness." The Belmont family, growing increasingly desperate, contacted Professor Elias Thornton from Yale College, who specialized in animal magnetism and mesmerism. He arrived in March 1846 and spent 2 weeks attempting to study the twins. His private journal tells a disturbing story. March 15, 1846. The subjects exhibit a connection that transcends any known biological or psychological mechanism. They complete each other's thoughts, mirror each other's movements, and display physiological responses that synchronize regardless of physical separation. More remarkably, they seem capable of projecting themselves beyond their physical bodies. I have verified with the household staff that both subjects were in their rooms at times when they were reportedly seen miles away. Professor Thornton's journal entry from March 22nd reveals his growing alarm. I have begun to dream their dreams, vivid visions of a time before their birth, of a single soul being torn in half, of darkness and light separating into distinct forms, of a terrible loneliness that can only be assuaged by reunification. The professor's final entry, dated March 24, 1846, is chilling. Last night, I was awakened around 3:00 a.m. by the sensation of being watched. When I opened my eyes, I saw them both standing at the foot of my bed, though I knew this was impossible, as their rooms were locked. They were holding hands, and where their hands joined, the boundary between them seemed to blur. They spoke in unison. "We are tired of being divided. We want to be whole again." Then they simply faded. I will recommend to the Belmonts that they release these women, for I do not believe any force on earth can keep them separated much longer. Professor Thornton's warning went unheeded. The Belmont family tightened their security measures instead. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation. On the night of April 30th, 1846, during a powerful thunderstorm, something occurred at the Belmont mansion that would never be fully explained. The following morning, the guards assigned to the East Wing were found unconscious. All three of them collapsed with identical expressions of terror frozen on their faces. When revived, none could remember what had happened, though one kept repeating, they merged, over and over. The twins' rooms stood open, both doors unlocked from the inside. The rooms themselves were empty, but on the wall between them was a mark that no one could adequately explain. It appeared to be a scorch mark, but it was neither wholly dark nor wholly light, seeming to shift between the two depending on the angle from which it was viewed. Its shape suggested a human form, but one that contained two figures overlapping, merging into a single impossible shape. More disturbing still was what was found in each room. In Dalia's darker quarters, everything had become slightly paler. In Lily's paler quarters, everything had darkened slightly. It was as though each twin had left behind some essence of herself, or perhaps had taken some essence of her other half in preparation for a merging that had finally occurred. The Belmont family immediately organized search parties, offering substantial rewards. But from that night forward, Dalia and Lily were never seen together again in any verifiable way. What did continue were sightings, reports that would persist for decades. Throughout the late 1840s and into the 1850s, people reported seeing strange figures at twilight, sometimes a dark woman alone, sometimes a pale woman alone, but most often both simultaneously in different locations. But there were other reports that spoke of something else entirely. Several witnesses claimed to have seen in particular lighting conditions a single figure that seemed to be both dark and light simultaneously. A woman whose appearance shifted depending on the angle of view. An account from 1849, recorded by a traveler named Marcus Whitfield, described such an encounter. I was riding along the Natchez Road at dusk when I saw a woman standing by the roadside. As I approached, I could not determine if she was of dark or pale complexion, for she seemed to be both. When I drew alongside her, she turned to face me, and I saw that she possessed 4 eyes, 2 dark and 2 pale, all looking at me with the same expression of profound sadness, mixed with triumph. I heard a voice, or perhaps 2 voices speaking in perfect unison, say, "We are almost whole again. Soon we will be one." Then she or they simply stepped backward and vanished. The Belmont family never recovered from the scandal. Charles Belmont died in 1848 of what physicians termed a wasting disease, though those who attended him spoke of how he would call out in his delirium about the merging and two becoming one. His wife Margaret retreated from society entirely. The mansion stood empty for many years, as no one wished to purchase a property with such a disturbing history. Interviews with descendants of enslaved people who had served in the Belmont household revealed that stories of the twins had been passed down through generations. One particularly detailed account came from the great-granddaughter of a chambermaid. "My great-grandma used to say that Miss Dalia and Miss Lily weren't really two people at all. She said they were one soul that had been split when they were born, and that they spent every moment trying to get back together. She said on the night the twins escaped, there was a sound like thunder, but not quite, and a flash of light that was both dark and bright at the same time. After that, nobody ever saw two separate girls again. What they saw was one being that was both and neither, something that existed between black and white, between separate and joined, between human and something else entirely." Throughout the remainder of the 19th century and into the 20th, reports continued. A farmer in 1867 reported seeing a woman who couldn't decide what color she was. A riverboat captain in 1889 described a figure that seemed to be two people overlapping. During a solar eclipse in 1918, multiple witnesses reported seeing a woman whose silhouette seemed to shift and change, darkening and lightening in rhythm with the eclipse itself. Most tellingly, the phenomenon of the dual fragrance continued to be reported, often preceding unusual events or appearing at sites where boundaries seemed thinning, crossroads, riverbanks, thresholds, mirrors, twilight hours. In 1923, an elderly woman named Delilah Johnson was interviewed by a graduate student. She made a statement that has become widely quoted. "People always ask what happened to those twin girls, but they're asking the wrong questions. Those girls didn't go nowhere. They finally got back together. They became what they were always meant to be. One soul in one body. Or maybe one soul that don't need a body no more. The white folks tried to keep them split apart because they were scared. Well, they did come together. And what happened is they became something we don't have a word for." In 1962, when the former Belmont mansion was scheduled for demolition, workers discovered that the east wing had been sealed shut with brick and mortar. When the wall was breached, the rooms remained almost pristine, but the scorch mark on the wall between the rooms remained visible. And workers reported that it seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Most significantly, when the rooms were cleared, workers discovered something hidden beneath the floorboards, a small wooden box containing two objects. One was a lock of black hair tied with a white ribbon. The other was a lock of white hair tied with a black ribbon. The hair had been intertwined so completely that it was impossible to separate the strands. When the box was opened, the dual fragrance filled the air so strongly that several workers had to leave. The hairlocks were donated to the Mississippi Historical Society. Attempts to analyze them using DNA technology yielded confusing results. The black hair and white hair showed genetic markers, suggesting they came from a single individual, as though one person had produced two distinct types of hair. Scientists have been unable to explain